Michael, well, I have the pleasure to meet you. We share this past life, Chrez background together. Even we had breakfast speaking in Chinese, entirely. Michael is Emeritus Professor of Politics in Goldsmiths, University of London, and Fellow of the Academy and the Social Sciences of Australia. A founding co-editor of the journal Postcolonial Studies, his research uses the Chinese archive to challenge the technocratic term in social theory. His work traces eclectic flows through the de-intensifications of market desire to the material intensities of the everyday, from urban street life to the art of the political. Michael, well, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks, Edgar. I'll actually start the way you did, with the conversation that we had the other night, when I asked you, how did you get involved in this thing? And the reason I was asking that is because I came here not knowing anybody, like not a soul. And it's that serendipity, I think, that in a way really speaks to questions of utopia, oddly enough. And it was serendipitous largely because the connection was because quite independently of Utopia, I'd been working for the past 10 and a half years, well, actually 16, 17 years at Goldsmiths, never having met. We'd seen each other. I recognized the face, but never. And it's not like Goldsmiths is a huge place. It's tiny. But this is Goldsmiths. Yes, but this is Goldsmiths, yeah.
There is no community.
Well, there is, but there is a lot of silos.
And they happen off-site. You know, this is also how that happens very often.
Absolutely, yeah. And for the past decade and a half, I've been working with a conceptual artist on a program in Goldsmiths on politics and art, which really is project-based, so it's group-based, and it's practice-based, so it's involved in actually producing things or material and immaterial things. But it's also produces neither art nor politics in the any conventional sense. And it was really in a sense, and because it was sort of this odd creature, if you like, we decided we would write it up. And part of that was to write up what I believed was relevant, and that became what I'm going to be giving today as part of a well, not a bigger work. The work's kind of not going to be that long, but this bit is called Moments of Communism, and that's where it seems to me that it connects quite strongly with utopias. And that's why I got the starting point for that is, of course, Marx. And for Moments of Communism. Okay. Oh, okay, thanks. All right, I can do that. Great, thanks. But I don't know how to operate this one. Okay, good. All right. Yeah. So just the arrows. Okay. Sorry, I'm a bit technically incompetent. All right. The first thing I wanted to say about this is if everybody, I'm sure, knows this quote, and probably many of you almost off by heart, because there's been endless discussion among kind of Marxist thinkers and intellectuals about the meaning of this short and very famous passage. But I don't give a shit about that. I don't give a shit whether it's too pastoralist or whether it comes from Fourier or whether it kind of Engels wrote it and Marx thought that it was ridiculous and was laughing his head off about it. In fact, I think it would be best if Marx was laughing his head off so much that he fell off the seat and ended up in the same excremental shit as George Batay, who's the excremental philosopher of laughter. Going back to the question of laughter. Why Batay? I'll press this button. Sorry, these overheads are pretty shitty. I don't know how to use keyboards. Anyway, it's a long story. But okay, so the reason I wanted to turn to Batay was because of something he wrote about heterogeneous energy. Now, heterogeneous energy is something that Karl Marx didn't care about. Why? Because capitalism, at least in production, didn't care about it. Heterogeneous energy was outside the production of things, and therefore outside of the Marxist theory of value. Heterogeneous energy. Homogeneous energy that Batai talks about is a different matter, but heterogeneous energy was outside of that, because heterogeneous energy, in Batai's reading, it's kind of piss and semen and kind of the excesses of the things that lie outside the working day. It's wasted energy and extraneous to what Marx is interested in, which is value creation in production. Now, the first point I want to make is, in these days, when we know that hidden data waste, what used to be the garbage in the cyber world, that hidden data is now, of course, the gold dust that's made Google rich, right? It's that waste, excess material that is now. So, given the fact that we now live in an age where actually that excess, that sort of that which is once lay outside of this productive model, we need to then perhaps look at least at a wider understanding of Batai's notion of energy. But before I do that, we need to kind of go back and unpick the dirty little secret that Marx uncovered when he talked about production. The question of production, he notes, is shrouded in the question of value production. And value production is really, in a sense, underpins this idea that labor creates all value. Again, Marx doesn't ignore the fact that there is wealth beyond human production. Nature's larder, of course, is kind of a simple. Sorry, I'm skipping this very quickly. Nature's larder provides the kind of raw materials that allow labor energy to be expended and to produce a value. Because it's only when labor produces the use value form that it gains a calculated form. So wealth, that is nature's larder, is nevertheless still an energy expenditure, just like labor power is a form of energy expenditure. But the raw materials are outside of the calculative schema because they are a given, right? Labor, therefore, in a sense, in this calculative schema, does create all value. But nevertheless, in focusing only on the expenditure of labor and limiting the analysis to the productive aspect of energy expenditure during the working day, we leave out much about the sources, distribution, transformational possibilities, and effects of energy circulation. That remains largely unsaid. And to get to a moment of communism, sorry, this is going to be a long, slow quote to the moment of communism. The end. To get to that kind of moment of communism, we need, I think, to broaden that question of energy beyond the working day. Rather than limiting the question of energy expenditure to labor time and labor power, this broader examination of energy expenditure raises, it seems to me, a whole set of different questions to those posed by Marx and opens up a very different road to the question of communism. And also just a different scaling of the question of communism. Why? Well, if you think about it, if we start to look broadly at energy, we think about things like geological rock formations, the pressure, the energy that goes into their formation. We look at the pollination of plants and the birds and the bees and the way in which they all, as it were, produce that energy, in a sense, is active within this sort of ecosystem. And it's upon this, of course, that labor produces its magic to produce the concept of a calculative limit. Now, this kind of model, it seems to me, is this where we just look at the calculative form that this analysis produces, is at the very least anthropocentric. And in an era of ecological crisis, it seems to me, it's that looking purely at the calculative limit of these things is both dangerous and outmoded. Having said that, I'm not calling for an ecologically based accountancy or an audit of the non-human element in the production of capital. I'm not asking for capitalist calculation machines to run rampant over the environment in order to produce a true cost. That's kind of quite a separate issue and one that I think is a disaster as well. Instead, what I'm asking us to do is, in a sense, look beyond what one might call, in a kind of a more artistic setting, look beyond the white cube logic of the working day, beyond the factory model that seems to be quite central to the Marxist understanding. Take use value. It's a very different notion of use that I'm trying to present here. Use value would refocus on the rechanneling, transformation, harnessing, intensification, scaling and descaling of the forms of the energy, and looking at the way in which energy is deployed. Energy which can bring about political change, which appears on picket lines, on barricades, on occupations. In Maoism, it's quite central, which is why in the... Oh, sorry, I haven't got one copy. But I've got a copy, like, in the book, I basically used Taibo Chang's image of the head-on, largely because, again, alluding to Deleuze, it's that sort of idea of political intensity being tied to the pack. Thank you. Anyway, sorry, but that was a slight advert there. That was an advertising break. You can click through and look interested.
I'll do it in between.
Okay, sorry. Anyway, but you know, it's not just in political revolutions. It's also in, you know, it kind of comes out not just in barricades and marches, but it also comes out in knitting circles and chess clubs. In other words, it comes out because of what Rancière would call a thing in common. I use that concept very differently to Rancière when he looks at it in terms of the ignorant schoolmaster. But the thing in common is the thing that Rancière. So Rancière looks at the thing in common as the device that brings attention to the student, that forces the student to be attentive. And it's in that moment of attention, he says, again, emancipation. I don't want to talk about the emancipation. I don't believe that he's talking about, I don't believe in the axiomatic quality of, axiomatic element of equality in Rancière, but let's leave that and maybe be discussed later. All I want to do is pull together the idea that this thing in common it sometimes takes political forms, which is what I dealt with in the book, but it also takes forms that we think of as non-political, which are in fact highly political. If you take energy and don't see it in the way that I've been discussing as a kind of limit. It's therefore a potential source of revolutionary energy, but it's also a form of potential disengagement from the capitalist system. In other words, energy itself is promiscuous. It does not have a political form. It does not have a left or a right situation. That promiscuity is both its strength and its weakness, because the refocused, rechanneled, transformed, and harnessed in a different way, it can also strengthen and elongate the capitalist system itself. Think again of the attention economy. We were talking about AI yesterday. The whole purpose of that is to keep you online, keep you attending, keep you going down your rabbit hole. The transformation of energy into material desires, it really, in a sense, underpins also the phantasmagoric form of the commodity form that Marx talks about. So energy expenditures can lead to political revolutions, but they can also lead to a kind of an apoliticalness and also to a kind of a reinforcing or a valorization of capitalism. So there are human energy, it seems to me, channeled toward producing the materialism, the materialist desire is kind of embedded in contemporary production processes, as it is in the post-production marketing of those items. That is to say, contrary to George Batay, there is no heterogeneous and homogeneous energy. There is just energy. And within the heterogeneous, there is also the homogeneous and vice versa. So we need to stop with this binary form. And for me, moments of communism really needs to begin with seeing energy neither as one thing or another, but to see it as a much more, in a very different way. And here I will turn to Chinese cosmology and to the idea of yin and yang, but I'll hold that off at least for a moment. I'll hold it off for a moment because I think one of the things that capitalism does, if if this is ignored by Marx, it is, in terms of the capitalist classes, it seems to me, it's only under-theorized. It's never undervalued. And capitalism, in a sense, runs on this, and the evidence of that, I think, was summed up by the guy with the thumbs down, Adorno. As stated earlier, it seems to me that the cyber industry would come to recognize that data waste was not garbage, but in a sense was absolutely gold dust that would inform both big data and the attention economy metrics of the current system. So in other words, that use of that sort of energy allows for profit generation. And the genius of the capitalist system, if we can call it that, is precisely in that ability to use energy, extract it, transform it, and then exploit it in particular ways. Okay, so let me kind of quickly move on. Now, the net result of that, it seems to me, is that within the system we live in, we are locked into a way of a series of mechanisms that basically make the system itself growth addicted. It cannot stop. It must grow. It must continue to expand. And as it expands, it also envelops not just production, but also the way we think about the world. There is, in a sense, almost a belief that there is nothing outside of that. And it also produces a sense that through this production, through this development of products, we get ever more closer to a promised land that, to use someone you were mentioning yesterday, Ernst Bloch, the not quite yet epistemology of something that the promises of material wealth that lay just over the horizon, if only we can get there. Okay. It also produces, as I think we're seeing more and more with the ordered culture of universities, a taylorization of the mind. So we basically, to steal a line from Adorno and Horkheimer again, and that taylorization of the mind underpins the ability of big data actually to make predictive metrics that then increasingly turn within the system itself into forms of subjectivity. And it's at this point, I think, when we see that promiscuity that can, as it were, either reinforce capitalism or alternatively be turned against it, that things become rather sticky. I'm using the word rather sticky here, drawing it from Sarah Ahmed's work on affective economies, because the other thing about this energy I'm talking about is its affective energy. For Sarah Ahmed, the question of affective energy is really all about intensities. It's all about intensities, and it's intensities that are highly political and about the intense racist, sexist, trans, and or homophobic desires that are unleashed. The stickiness I want to talk about is a much sweeter elixir from the capitalist system, but it's so sweet it starts to make you sick until it finally kills you. Marx's desire was to actually not be, he wasn't at all interested in sweetness or desire. What he was interested in was scientific calculability. A calculability that, in a sense, sorry, these are long, and you don't have to read them all. I just put them up because I wanted to have a private class. Okay. Anyway, yeah. So basically, well, there is something important in there, the highlighted bits. What Althusser, interestingly enough, what Althusser began in his later life to criticize was this not just the Hegelianism of the early part of Capital. You know, if you've read Lenin's philosophy, you'll know he criticized the early part of Hegelian and therefore unscientific. But rather the very mechanism, the scientific mechanisms that Marx was using within that first section, which he says, and I've highlighted them there, the arithmetic presentation of surplus value therefore produces this idea of labor power figuring purely and simply as a commodity itself. Interesting for the guy who believed in a science of Marxism, I think. And from an energy perspective then, what an examining, in a way, instead of hiving off that little bit of labor power that's concerned with production, if we look at the whole of the energy flow, what does it reveal? Well, it helps us, as it were, understand again something that George Batay was talking about when he talks about successive revolutions that have continued to this day, because his focus on the heterogeneous element of knowledge allows him to actually understand at least the way in which energy can in fact be, it does exist outside of that labor power. The problem with George Batay is, as I said before, that binary form that he puts in place to try and understand the flow of energy. And it's that binary form that I really want to bring into question here. Energy, far from being bifurcated, has no intrinsic predetermined form or worth, but emerges instead in specific contexts, in specific usages. Only then can it be named. And it's in that sense, because it can only be named, as it were, in those particular moments, that I would draw then on Chinese traditional Taoist cosmology. I draw on it in two respects. First, I draw on it to count to three instead of the binary. Right? The point of Taoism is Dao Sheng Yi, Yi Sheng Er, Er Sheng One. Right? In other words, one produces two, two produces three, three produces everything. And so we get to the three rather than working from the binary. That's the first point. The second point I want to pull on is the idea of qi. And in that book, which I will do a short advert for at the minute, in that book, I basically take this whole understanding of qi, which is conveniently translated in English as vital energy. I take that basically, because I'm no Taoist scholar, I worked through traditional Chinese medicine. I looked at acupoints. I look at the way in which acupoints map the body in a way that we can think of not the body, but the body politic. And so, in a sense, this kind of unfolding of the idea of qi is quite central to that. Also, the advantage of working with this idea of vital energy or qi allows us to kind of turn to the image, yin and yang. You can see, in the white there's always black, and in the black there's always white. There is no binary. There is rather a melding of things that can be actually associated with certain states of being. Certain states of being we call wuxing, which again is mistranslated often as 5 elements. They're not elements, they're phases. The 5 phases of vital energy, they're not thing concepts, but rather they're basically counterpunctual, interrelated, mutually transformative, and mutually dependent. And the 5 phases, as they are sometimes translated, are water, or fire, or wood, metal, and earth. And basically, we're not talking about substances here. We are talking about essentially effects. We're talking about what they do. Water will trickle downwards. Fire will flare upwards. Earth, which is rendered often as the telluric, as the seeded form from which grows, is not a nomos. It's not a root form. Rather, it is simply an element that will go through. So, under these conditions, everything is in flight and in flux, and only a vague, ethereal sense of the notion of qi comes to the surface. To quote an ancient Chinese, essentially medical documentary, it's much like birds' wings that have fluttered and left, and yet no one has captured the form. So you know they exist because of the fluttering of the wings, but you can't see them. Unlike the energy that feeds into Marx's notion of labor power, then, or even Batai's notion that feeds into the idea of the heterogeneous, this idea of vital energy, or qi, endlessly changing, operating differently in different contexts, in different times, in different locations, different landscapes, and so forth, through a variety of different forms, comes to inform not just the way people think, but the way they act. From the building of the cities, which in a sense, okay, superficially they look very Confucian, but underpinning them is an idea of the flow of energy, which is why you've got geomancy, like feng shui, which, the houses are located in a particular way to try and channel and direct and harness that energy. We look at, as I say, acupuncture, and I've got body up there. Again, to try and look at the way in which to make a harmonious flow through the body. It is important also in wushu, well, not karate, but probably is. Anyway, but wushu, the punch carries not just, it's not physical, it also carries qi. Just as the calligrapher's stroke carries qi, just as the zither carries qi from the instrument into the bodies of others. So we have this kind of question, this idea of energy that's much more fluid, coming out of a non-Western tradition and breaking the binary which underpins so much of our thinking, from state and civil society right through to I and thou. There's also a question in terms of moments that I want to deal with, which is, how much time have I got left? I've got, okay, that's good. 20. Well, I'm racing.
You are.
We'll have more time for Edgar to finish the final point. Yeah, there's also the issue of rescaling the whole question. Marx talks about modes. Modes are beyond any comprehension of how the hell do you change a mode. But a moment, we all live them. We've all had those moments, those serendipitous moments when we felt, wow, this is possibly one. So it's rescaling the question, and I want to deal with that and the question of how the fluidity and multiplicity of forms can make up, along with the rescaling, a moment of communism. Analysing a moment is therefore quite different from analysing the fixity, solidity, and the unity of what Marx calls a mode of production. In moving from mode to moment, even a simple act of changing the scale forces us to rethink questions. And here I want to turn to some work that was done in Parsons, actually, by one of the scholars there, Otto von Busch, who's a design theorist. Okay, sorry, I shouldn't get to that yet. Okay, he wrote a book a number of years back called Making Trouble. He's a kind of an activist scholar. And what he was, he says in his first class, he basically asks the students to make a justice machine. What the hell is a justice machine? How do you make a justice machine?
I will tell you later.
Well, I will tell you now. Because but I will tell you through von Busch and what he talked about. Von Busch is a Swede. He was talking about when he grew up in Sweden. In winter it was freezing cold. Yeah, he was 12, 13, and the little kids were all pushed, like at lunchtime they locked the doors and they were all sent out, and it was freezing cold. The bigger kids, he said, were under the shelter because they were smoking and bullied them, so they were pushed out into the cold. So they felt really this was a great injustice. So together they got, these junior students got together and thought, how are we going to solve this problem? And the way they solved it was they figured out that they appealed to the teachers, and that fell on deaf ears. So much for the force of the better argument. But with ingenuity and cunning, what they started to do was devise a way to get back into the school and be in the warmth of the classroom during lunchtime. How did they do that? Well, after many failed attempts and experiments, they discovered that their school-issued plastic library card could be repurposed to help them pick the lock. And so they used their metalwork class to devise a little hook. So we come to a calculation here. Political science is very keen on calculation. Here's my response. Hook plus library card equals justice machine. Okay, so the brilliance of that example is its simplicity, but also it seems to me it's got an importance in terms of those moments of communism. Those moments when you can actually turn things around through the cracks and through the fissures within the system itself. That fluidity and temporariness of the moment operates outside the unity and rigidity of the vectors that these grandiose historic stages of Marxism presents. And simply with a plastic card and a hook, these don't have any meaning outside of the context in which these are contextual. They don't have any intrinsic meaning. A hook isn't a kind of a given justice machine. It's simply a hook. It's only when it's combined with other things, when we kind of tie these things together, that they gain a particular meaning. A bit like tea. Okay, So, let me move on. Yeah, okay, so the next bit is, and this is why I wanted to come to, back to the guy with the pipe, Louis Althusser. Because the guy with the pipe, again in later life, this was after he was mad, but nevertheless, again, interesting kind of comment he makes about communism here, which is, he was asked by a journalist in France in, I think, the 80s, about communism. And he says, you know, we've got communism right now. And the journalist goes, what? Right now? And he goes, yeah. He says that, you know, we've got islands of communism everywhere across the world, in churches, in trade unions, and even in certain branches of the Communist Party. Surprise, surprise. Right. So, in a way, what he's doing there is like the justice machine, or this quiet and unassuming church group, or trade union, or you know, in an odd sort of way, all of these are tied together, or even in the passionate collection of books. Speaking of which, this is again one of the ways in which I think we need to think through these things. Remember, sorry, I used these in a class I was teaching in China, which is why it's not, I wasn't going to be pretentious. It's just, although I did come across very pretentiously, I know. But, sorry, but it was just, I was in a, okay. Anyway, what Benjamin was interested in unpacking my library was not the collection, it was the collector. It was the way in which the collector's passion overrode the question of ownership. Collecting rather than collection was what he was interested in, because, as he says, it divests things of their commodity form. And you divest them of their commodity form by taking possession of them, not just owning them. Possession rather than ownership becomes crucial here. And Adorno, in correspondence with Benjamin about this, talked about this being the magic side of the process. And it's that magic side, it seems to me. Passion that takes you beyond money, intensity that takes you beyond reason, and that drives the collector out of the capitalist world into a world of their own, even as an individual form. Of course, this has to be collectivized, but as an individual form, possession, albeit momentarily, inflects us into a different mode of habitation. And it's that I find interesting here. Instead, for the collector, the process is a redemptive act. It's not just an act of collector. And I'm sure with your record collection you know this.
Sadly.
Yeah, I know. That's why you were bemoaning its loss this morning. Anyway, sorry. And I want to take you to it induces what Benjamin talks about as a weak messianism. And it's that weak messianism that I kind of wanted to think about a little bit more through something as simple as Michael Asher's untitled work, which was a water fountain in the University of California, San Diego. Asher installed a water fountain, and it's literally a drinking fountain. So it takes Michael Asher's work beyond pure public art. It becomes, but because of its use value, it becomes more than an Asher, right? More than a fountain. But also, not just more than an Asher. Because it's Asher who did it, it becomes more than a water fountain. So it lives in this sort of strange space, which resulted in it being no ordinary drinking fountain. And what we found was, what happened was, students would end up, before their exams, the students would all line up and take a sip of the water from the magic fountain before they went into their exams. In other words, these are little mechanisms that actually twist things around. And Asher does this quite a lot. He changes, Asher's work articulates relations between individual modes of viewing behavior and their epistemic frames of references. And it seems to me what that work is doing is something that within philosophy is really, in a sense, challenging the categories and distributions and redistributions that we make in any model. Which brings me to my final pretentious slide. Sorry, you might be able to read this, so I read it out for you. It's from Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein says, some of the greatest achievements in philosophy could only be compared with taking up some books which seem to belong together and putting them in different shelves. That reshelving of then creates this shock effect, if you like, or this alienation effect where you suddenly say, aha, there's a different way of seeing the world, a different way of viewing things. And I'm interested in those, as it were, material and immaterial forms that allow us to push, like the water fountain, like the muddling up of categories that he does with public art, or like the way in which Wittgenstein mentions this in terms of the shelving of things, the way in which these, as it were, forms really discombobulate, challenge, but also open up onto things that might make you rethink the world and live it somewhat differently. Books that are shelved uncomfortably together over time are what come to be called like species, or in academia they're called disciplines. And in a way, what we need to do is to kind of try and shake those things up before we can start to even begin to talk about moments of communism or Greekopia. Maybe, but it's in the cracks that we're able to do that. Okay, so let me try and then sum up the possibilities that are available here. The potential of the knowledge effect of misshelved books, of justice machines. I think all of these highlight the possibilities that open up once we start to think of the moment rather than the mode. Once we start to descale and come down to briefness rather than trying to think how do we change the world. Once again, let me repeat the point that whether these moments are big, small, fluid, momentary, interconnected, independent, they are utterly and absolutely promiscuous. And they're contradictory. But they are all about and contoured by energy, affective energy flows. So, it's not so much a direct challenge to the dominant capitalist mode, but rather a bit like the dripping effect of water, where things start to seep away, where one can, as it were, move away from those massive categories. Remember, Deleuze and Guattari would talk about micro-fascism. We can talk about micro-communism. We can start to think of this a bit differently. And maybe it begins by putting books on different shelves, or recognizing a collectivity within the form of the collector in the passion for collecting books. Moments such as these have to be existential. The reason why the Benjamin example is individual and therefore doesn't quite work is because it needs to be collective. We need these, but the thoughts, if you think of the collector as a group, as a grouping, it seems to me we need, each one of them has an existentially felt attachment to their possession, but in a sense it's collectively lived. We can understand it collectively. So we need that sort of individually felt moment, but it needs to be collectively lived. And it seems to me if we can get to those sorts of moments that don't take on any singular form, are quite promiscuous, are about channeling the energy toward these particular moments, then we certainly have a chance to knock Karl Marx off his chair and start to think about this question differently. Thank you.